In my past research, I looked at blues music, but I am interested also a little bit in how this has continued. Black masculinity is also still a part of the reception of hip-hop, for instance, today, where you also have a shift to some extent from largely black audiences to at least partly and now even predominantly white audiences. But black masculinity remains a marker of authenticity for these audiences that see, that consume the music. So if you look at sort of the structure of the recording industry, you have sort of white people with suits on top, and then you have the black men that are on the cover of the album, but then you have, you know, the white audiences that consume that particular authenticity. One of the interesting things about blues music is that commercialization set in pretty early. So we can, you know, even when blues was a predominantly black music, you have, I mean, people wanted to make music from the get-go. So that was part of the impetus of performing blues. There's an increase to some extent of this commercialization taking place after World War II, and in particular in the late 1960s as blues gains a different audience, as more white people both in the US and Europe become interested in blues music. And so that sort of also leads to some extent to sort of a transplanted blues culture that is then consumed by white audiences, but still produced to some extent by African Americans. And so sometimes there's a little bit of a mismatch between the audience and what they perceive as real or authentic blackness and what the performers themselves think that they're representing, and that leads to some very interesting sort of conflicts and communication problems. Well, one of the things that has happened is when you talk to people today in Germany about the reception of blues in the 60s that lived through that period, some of them have also modified their views in the course of the decades that have passed, and so sometimes they might refer to other kinds of they might talk about the past in a different way. That's why I really enjoy looking at primary sources too. If you look at actually what people said at the time, what magazines wrote at the time, because that is quite different from, you know, how you look at it, you know, 30 years later. So you're shaped by the way racial conceptualizations are shaped within society. As they change, there's also a different way of looking at the past. And I think that's happened with some of these people, so that they might look at what they did earlier in a more problematic way themselves too.
Have you ever encountered anger?
No, not anger per se, but I have encountered some resistance from people, in particular people who are blues scholars, more so than people who are blues fans. And that is because in terms of blues scholarship has been dominated by British and American white man for a long time, and so they have a very specific and sometimes romantic view of what blues is, and so they don't like that to be messed with. So, and that's what I'm doing. So in the project I'm currently doing research on, I'm working on a book proposal on a book project on krautrock, German rock music and electronic music in the 1970s. Krautrock as in sauerkraut, a term invented by the British music press, but that also stuck. And that music is interesting also in regards of the intersections between national identity, globalization, localization, hybridization. How does music get transformed in the process of moving from one place to another? How do these musicians deal with Americanization? In many ways, they reject the Anglo-American influences in music. They try to produce something that is very different. They also try to reject the Nazi past. But in the process, what they're doing is influential in the United States and in Great Britain for many of the younger indie bands in particular today. So that is quite interesting for me. Why do they care about German music from the 1970s? And they do.